Today we will be talking about Chapter 3, which is Neuroscience and Behavior. This is a picture of what neurons look like in real life in tissue. I think it's a very cool picture, and I'm very excited to be talking about neuroscience and behavior with you today. So let me just start with a few basic facts about the brain. It's an amazing organ. It's made up of many different systems that communicate with each other. It's what controls our whole body, our temperature, whether we're tired, whether we're hungry. And neuroscience is an intriguing but also complex field. So it's almost as if the more we know, the more we understand how much we don't know. And also, the study of the brain helps us understand our behavior as humans from two perspectives, from the nature and nurture perspective. When you're learning about the brain, and I've done this in many different capacities as a research assistant, graduate student, undergraduate student, it's important to recognize that the brain is complex and it can be difficult to understand how the parts and systems work together. But in order to really understand, you have to, and evaluate and critically examine neuroscience, it's really important to sort of think about what are the building blocks. And that consists of answering the question of what's the function of the brain, what are the basic elements that serve that function, and how do these basic elements interact. And finally, I just want to encourage you to keep thinking about asking questions, remembering to breathe, taking a break. It's important to sort of listen to what you're feeling when you're studying this information. So this, in Module 7, we're going to answer 3 questions, or our learning objectives are: why do psychologists study the brain and the nervous system? What are the basic elements of the nervous system? And how do the nervous systems communicate messages from one part to another? So the most basic, essential part of the nervous system is called the neuron. It is a nerve cell. It has a cell body with a nucleus. It's physically in place by glial cells. And these glial cells provide nourishment, they insulate, they repair damage. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a video in a moment of that a scientist completed of neurons that he had magnified from his research. So you will see the video soon.
Neuron. This neuron is shown 20,000 times larger as in reality. At this tremendous magnification, a hair would be 6 feet thick. These incredible organic chips function through electric signals. They control nearly everything we do, from thinking to moving muscles, from sensing to hearing, and even watching this video. Extensions at the top of the neuron are called dendrites. These dendrites receive signals from other neurons. As long as the inhibiting blue signals dominate, the neuron will remain silent. But as soon as the activating red signals dominate, an electric pulse is sent through the thick lower tube of the neuron. This tube is called the axon of the neuron. Neurons are not alone. The brains of a human contain 100 billion neurons. If we were to walk through a single human brain at this pace, it it would take over 300 years to just take a glimpse at all the neurons.
So what I love about that video is it gives you sort of a picture of what a neuron is, a 3D version, but also sort of the importance and how many we have of them. So understanding their structure and how they connect is really important in sort of understanding how the brain works together. So the structure of the neuron, as the video said, a dendrite is at the top of the neuron. It's a cluster of fibers at one end that receives information from other neurons. The axon is the tube. It's the part of the neuron that carries the message that's destined for other neurons. The terminal buttons are what the small bulges at the end that send the message on to other neurons. And on the axon is the myelin sheath, which is a protective coat of fat and protein that erupts around the axon. So this diagram gives a cartoon of what the action potential looks like along an axon. So if you look at time 1, time 2, and time 3, you can see that for each one there is an increase in voltage. So the natural charge of the axon is negative, but there's an influx of positive charge which causes the action potential. And the action potential always moves the direction of the impulse down the axon. So this is sort of a magnification of the neuron axon. And down here you can sort of see more numbers of what this represents. So when there's a negative charge, you see a negative at a resting potential or a resting state. The charge of the axon is negative 70 millivolts. However, when the action potential occurs, the millivolts increases to about 40 or 50. But it's a very short time period, and then after each action potential, there is a resting state where the neuron cannot fire again until a certain time has passed. So what determines the speed of the neuronal transmission? So the axon size, the thickness of the myelin sheath. So mature neurons have more myelin, which promotes greater connection and the speed. Also the firing rate and the quickness of the impulse, and the intensity of the stimulus that causes the action potential. So mirror neurons are neurons that give us a sense, it helps explain why humans have the capacity to understand others' intentions. And so I'm going to show a bit of a TED Talk that I think is really important by a famous neuroscientist, and he will relate this video to. So how do you go about studying? So let's just listen to what this this neuroscience expert has to say about the brain and mirror neurons.
I'd like to talk to you today about the human brain. This is what we do research on at the University of California. Just think about this problem for a second. Here's a lump of flesh, about 3 pounds, which you can hold in the palm of your hand. But it can contemplate the vastness of interstellar space. It can contemplate the meaning of infinity, ask questions about the meaning of its own existence, about the nature of God. And this is truly the most amazing thing in
adult human brain. Each neuron makes something like 1,000 to 10,000 contacts with other neurons in the brain. And based on this, people have calculated that the number of permutations and combinations of brain activity exceeds the number of elementary particles in the universe. So how do you go about studying the brain? One approach is to look at patients who had lesions in different parts of the brain and study changes in their behavior. This is what I spoke about in the last tab. Today I'll talk about a different approach, which is to put electrodes in different parts of the brain and actually record the activity of individual nerve cells in the brain. And sort of eavesdrop on the activity of the nerve cells in the brain. Now, one recent discovery that has been made by researchers in Italy, Parma, Giacomo Rizzolatti and his colleagues, is a group of neurons called mirror neurons, which are in the front of the brain, in the frontal lobes. Now, it turns out there are neurons which are called ordinary motor command neurons in front of the brain, which have been known for about 50 years. These neurons will fire when a person performs a specific action. For example, if I do that and reach and grab an apple, a motor command neuron in the front of my brain will fire. If I reach out and pull an object, another neuron will fire, commanding me to pull that object. These are called motor command neurons that have been known for a long time. And what Rizzolatti found was a subset of these neurons, maybe about 20% of them, will also fire when I'm looking at somebody else performing the same action. So here's a neuron that fires when I reach and grab something, but it also fires when I watch Joe reaching and grabbing something. This is truly astonishing, as though this neuron is adopting the other person's point of view. So it's almost as though it's performing a virtual reality simulation of the other person's action. Now, what is the significance of these mirror neurons? For one thing, they must be involved in things like imitation and emulation, because to imitate a complex act requires my brain to adopt the other person's point of view. So this is important for imitation and emulation. But why is that important? Well, let's take a look at the next slide. So, how do you do imitation? Why is imitation important? Mirror neurons in imitation and emulation. Now, let's look at culture, the phenomenon of human culture.
So we'll start with the point about imitation, and I think that as you can see in this image right here, this is a researcher named Andrew Metzloff, and what he found was that even when babies are just born, that they can imitate. So they have, that there are mirror neurons. So if you look at a baby that is 12 hours old, stick your tongue out, they'll do the same thing. So that's an example of mirror neurons. We can also think about this as important in terms of empathy feelings. So we've talked about the structure of a neuron, and now we have to talk about, well, where do neurons meet? So there's something called bridging the gap. So a synapse is the space between two neurons, where one neuron that's sending the message communicates with another. And the neurotransmitters carry certain messages across the synapse to the dendrite of the receiver neuron. So you can almost think of it as a telephone where from one neuron you're calling another. So, and in that space between is the operator. So this is a figure of what the synapse is. And basically, let's take a look at this. So this is the cartoon of each step. So in step 1, the neurotransmitters are produced and stored in this axon right there. At step 2, if the action potential arrives, it will release what we call neurotransmitter, which are chemicals in the brain. And these neurotransmitters, as you can see right here, will travel across the synapse and onto these receptor sites. And when the neurotransmitter fits into the receptor site, it's important. If it does not fit into the receptor site, the message will not, the neurotransmitter will not carry the message. It will fire, it will make the neuron fire, the receiver neuron fire. And it can fire in two ways. It can be an excitatory message, and sometimes a neuron will send a message. However, there will be, that message can be inhibiting future firing. So One example of this, the neurotransmitter, is GABA. So it is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Its function really is around eating, aggression, sleep. If you are very full, your brain will send inhibitory messages to other neurons so that you don't continue eating. Um, Dopamine can be inhibitory or excitatory. Um, we've, I'm sure you've heard about Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease is when you have too little dopamine. And then schizophrenia is when you have too much dopamine. So if you have too many excitatory messages going on, you can have delusions. However, you can have extensive, if, if you have too little dopamine, you cannot inhibit motor movement. So you have what they call tremors for people with Parkinson's disease. Another very commonly talked about one is serotonin. It has to do a lot with depression, sleeping, eating, pain. Endorphins, we've all that endorphins of after you exercise, you feel great. Um, so that release of endorphins. Um, Acetylcholine is another one, glutamate. So I think you just sort of need to realize that all of these neurotransmitters are located in the brain, except some of them are in other parts of the nervous system. And the effects that they have are different, and they have different functions. So they're found in different parts of the brain. So, as I was saying, it's really important that the receptor be able to receive the neurotransmitter. And there are two different kinds of messages. There's excitatory and inhibitory. Um, and I think I'm going to show you a quick video of a synapse. So here you can see in this video that it's a visualization of the positive charge going into the axon, which is producing the action potential, which is traveling down the axon. So now we're reaching the end of the neuron with our terminal buttons right there, and they are releasing the neurotransmitters. And when the neurotransmitter is released, once they bind with the receptor right there, the receptors open and transmit the message along. So moving forward, we're going to look at the nervous system and the endocrine system, so communicating with the body. So how are these structure of the nervous system linked, and how does the nervous system affect our behavior? So the central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. And the spinal cord, as you can see in this picture here, which is from the textbook, is a bundle of neurons that leaves the brain and runs down the length of the back. And on the spinal cord are spinal nerves. So it's the main means of transmitting messages between the brain and the body. So the central and peripheral nervous system includes what or When talking about the central and peripheral nervous system, it's important to talk about what we call reflex, so an automatic involuntary response. So when you go to the doctor and they tap your knee, they want to see a kick. We're rooting with infants, so for the first 3 months, if you sort of rub an infant's cheek, they will turn their head towards the source, towards in that direction if they're hungry. So when we are talking about reflexes, there are two kinds of neurons involved. Sensory, which are afferent neurons, they transmit information from the perimeter of the body to the central nervous system. And then the motor neurons, which communicate information from the nervous system to the muscle glands. So, as I was saying, you're cooking soup on the stove, you touch it, it's hot. Those sensory neurons are going to send a message through your the muscles, to the spine, to the brain, saying she's touching something hot. The motor neurons are then going to communicate with the muscles in my body to remove my hand from the hot stove. And when we sort of look from a diagram perspective of the nervous system, we can divide it again into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system has a brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is a little bit more complicated. It has all the other parts of the nervous system other than the brain and the spinal cord. And there's some more divisions. So there's the somatic division, which is voluntary. So I want to kick the soccer ball. I'm going to kick the soccer ball. That's sort of movements. I want to walk. I'm going to pick my feet up. Automatic and voluntary is more of things that function without our awareness. So we've talked, I'm sure you've heard about the fight or flight phenomenon. If something happens to you and you see a bear and you need to run, the sympathetic division of your peripheral nervous system is going to activate the body to respond. You're going to run away. You're going to flight, right? Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system is then going to come in and calm the body down. It's going to help you breathe. It's going to, as we can see, here, it's going to control your heartbeat, and so forth. So it's hard, sometimes people get this understanding the difference between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. What helped me was, if I think about paralyzing, it's slowing down, it's stopping. And sympathizing is you're reacting with someone. So if someone is really sad, your body is going to adjust to your response is going to adjust to their sadness. Or if someone is scared, someone's hurt, you're going to rush over and help them. So here is a really nice example of the autonomic nervous system. So when your sympathetic nervous system is activated, again, it's going to increase. Your blood vessels are going to contract. It's going to inhibit activity in your stomach. Your heart rate is going to increase. So you have more oxygen. You're going to have increased air in your lungs. Your pupils are going to dilate, so you have better vision. Whereas that recovery period is going to be, your heart rate is going to slow down. You're going to have your blood vessels are going to dilate. You're going to contract your pupils. So the endocrine system is a really important part of our body. And this is that it sends messages via the bloodstream. and it tells us about our basic being, basic functions. So, hormones. Hormones are not just relevant for puberty. Hormones help create the homeostasis of our body. So, it regulates the functioning and growth of the body. So, the pituitary gland is something that secretes hormones that control growth in other parts of the endocrine system. So, what I'd like to do here is show you a quick video from a doctor who gives a very nice summary. She's talking about pituitary tumors, but I think she does a nice job of sort of giving an overview function of what the pituitary gland does better than I could, and she has some nice visuals. So I'll check back in with you in a moment when I have the video up and running.
The pituitary gland is a pea-sized gland that sits essentially right in the center of the brain. It actually is housed in a part of the skull that is known as the sella, which gives it a little bit of room to actually grow. Because the pituitary gland is such an important gland and life is really not sustainable without it, it is highly protected within the brain. And if you go up through the nose and straight back, you will hit the pituitary gland. It does lie right beneath the optic chiasm, which is the crossing of the optic nerves. And it is one of the concerns that we have when people develop pituitary tumors, because they can sometimes grow large enough to actually put pressure on the optic nerves and affect vision. The pituitary is considered the master gland by many in the body because it regulates. So the pituitary gland is a pea-sized gland that sits essentially right in the center of the brain. It actually is housed in a part of the skull that is known as the sella, which gives it a little bit of room to actually grow. Because the pituitary gland is such an important gland and life is really not sustainable without it, it is highly protected within the brain. And if you go up through the nose and straight back, you will hit the pituitary gland. It does lie right beneath the optic chiasm, which is the crossing of the optic nerves. And it is one of the concerns that we have when people develop pituitary tumors, because they can sometimes grow large enough to actually put pressure on the optic nerves and affect vision. The pituitary is considered the master gland by many in the body because it regulates the production of other hormones from glands located elsewhere. And those hormones include the production of thyroid hormone by the thyroid gland. It runs the adrenal glands with the production of ACTH. It produces growth hormone, which has a multitude of functions, but particularly in children regulates growth and development. It also produces prolactin, which is important in terms of lactation during pregnancy, and it regulates water and fluid balance. So usually pituitary tumors, unless they become larger than 1.5 centimeters, do not compress other brain tissue and do not cause other problems. However, when it does exceed above a 1.5 centimeter, we do worry about it extending and compressing above that area and into other tissues.
So now that we've talked about the sort of parts of the brain or basic structures of the brain, I think, and some of the functions, it's important to identify some of the major parts and the functions of the brain. So what behavior are they responsible for? And then how do the two halves of the brain operate independently? So, well, this takes me back to, how do we know what we know about the brain? What tools have we used? So these are 4 different techniques, and there are many more out there to look at, spy on the brain, or eavesdrop on the brain, as the neuroscientist said in his TED Talk. There's EEG, which records the electrical activity through electrodes placed on the outside of the skull. With animals, you can do models where you actually put electrodes inside the skull or in the brain itself. fMRI, it can tell us where in the brain is being activated based on a stimulus. PET and transcranial magnetic stimulation is another way to do this. And this is sort of the area of neuroscience research that's constantly evolving is the methodology that we're using to study the brain. So this is an example of event-related potentials. It was done by my advisor, and basically I just wanted to show you an example of research. So if you look right here, this is the waveform of the average waveform of babies' neural responses to, as you can see in the color-coded, an upright monkey face versus an inverted monkey face. So what you can see here is that there was a greater neural response to a monkey face that was upside down as compared to when the monkey face was right side up. And so this gives us a clue that these infants had a differential response to a certain visual stimulus. So the book breaks it down into the new brain and the old brain. So the central core is what controls all the basic functions, eating, sleeping, breathing, that are common to all vertebrates. The hindbrain contains the medulla, the pons, and so here's our medulla, here's our pons, and again, these are, what I really want you to understand is that the old brain is focusing on survival, your body surviving. The cerebellum, which is right here, is the portion of the brain that controls your balance. So when you ride a bike, it activates your cerebellum. And this is just more sort of technical terms here, but I want you to keep noticing the function of each one of these. So the reticular formation is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So that's a general area of the brain. It really controls arousal, attention, sleep, awareness. The thalamus, which is right here in the center of the brain, is it's the relay between the sensory information up here and the lower brain. And the hypothalamus is that tiny part of the brain that maintains homeostasis. So are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Are you sleepy? And the basic elements of survival. Moving a little bit beyond this idea of are you breathing to how should your body respond to the environment. So the limbic system, you can think of this as sort of like the behavior monitor. It controls eating, reproduction, aggression, all of those basic behaviors that we see in life beyond the involuntary ones. So it's the animal brain. Oftentimes, there's research that shows that veterans with PTSD have a very overactive limbic system, and they need medication to help inhibit some of the neural activity that's going on in there. And it can also play an important role in memory. So one more point is that there is a lot of, so that fear, aggression, memory, it all ties together. So if we think about the vets who have PTSD, it makes sense because they have an emotion associated with a memory, and so that's activating, it's activating their limbic system. So the cerebral cortex, our new brain, there are 4 lobes. There's the parietal lobe, and that's primarily responsible for sensory processing, touch, smell, pressure, pain. The occipital lobe, which is visual processing. Temporal lobe, auditory processing, hearing, memory. And the frontal lobe, which is cognition, which can be described as reasoning, planning, executive functioning, speech, movement, making decisions. And in our cerebral cortex, there's what we call in the sensory area. So the somatosensory area is related, so is found right about here. And this diagram gives us an understanding of the amount of tissue in the somatosensory area is related to the sensitivity of the body part. So if you think about what we perceive, our lips, our tongues, and our hands, we have a lot of perception in our hands. They're very sensitive. They get cold easily. They get hot. They get sweaty. They feel pressure. They feel pain. So this diagram is a good example of how the body is represented sensitivity-wise in the tissue itself of the brain. So neuroplasticity, another one of my favorite things to talk about, it's the changes in the brain that occur. It's the creation of the new interconnections between the neurons. It's how things reorganize. Neurogenesis is when new neurons are created in areas of the brain during adulthood. In previous lectures, I had mentioned the study about speech pathology methods, looking at people who had aphasia as a result of a stroke, and what they found was that the people who had the sing-song speech therapy as opposed to traditional speech therapy had made more neural connections when they did a structural MRI. You know, I'm sure you see this in the news. There's all sorts of research out there looking at retired age people, and they say if you dance, if you play bingo, if you volunteer, that you have experience less memory problems, so forth. All of this is about maintaining the brain and the connections between the neurons in your brain. It's engaging, it's stimulating. So as I said, I'm really interested in human development. So I wanted to show you this slide that I've used many times in my lectures before. So this is a diagram right here looking at, in general, the first year and the neural connections that occur. So the sensory pathways, as you can see, are the first to develop, right? Then you can see language comes next. And higher cognition is going on, but there's sort of a more general, a more gradual increase in cognitive functions. So I have a 1-year-old, and she can recognize things visually and can say no. She looks at a picture and she has some language. She says baby, but she can tell the difference between a baby and a pig much easier than she can say baby herself. And so she's had more visual practice. There's a whole area of research looking at face processing in infancy. And that's primarily because the first part of the brain that develops is the visual or the occipital lobe. So we talked about neuroplasticity, neurogenesis. This is taken from a newborn. This is what the neurons look like when a baby is a newborn. And as you can see, and this is in the occipital lobe, even just 30 days later, there are many more connections. And by 6 months, which you can also see corresponding to the graph above, is when you reach the peak of visual development and neural connections. The axons are more developed. You can see they're thicker. They've changed in length. There's more myelin. The synapses themselves have also changed. There's more connectivity. And by the time you get to 24 months, you can see that there really is this neural network. So, 2-year-olds have faster processing than 6-month-olds because you can see their brains are more mature. So the book talks about split brain, the specialization of the hemispheres. 2 brains are 1. So there are 2 hemispheres. The left and right halves of the brain control the opposite side. The lateralization, the dominance of one hemisphere over the of the brain in specific functions. So if the left brain functions analytic thought, logic, much more linear type activities, numbers, math, science, whereas, you take a quiz, are you right-brained or left-brained? Creativity for right-brained, imagination, intuition, insight, and so forth. And that's the end of our slides. I look forward to hearing your questions, and thank you very much for your time and your patience in waiting for this lecture to be posted. Look forward to learning with you soon.